Hello, this is Blaine Bridges, and welcome to Pop Theology. During a planned debate about the merits of the Western canon, in which I argued for the scandalous position that its content should remain unchanged by diversity-minded intellectuals, I asked a young woman who was agitated by my view whether she believed that in our present age we knew better than our ancestors who formalized the canon. With a blithe smile, she gave her affirmation. The insouciance of her answer was made more incredible by its certainty. There was no doubt in the virtue that she, and by extension everyone who held her view, possessed. When I inquired as to why our integrity was beyond reproach, she retorted that we had abolished slavery. As I stared into this woman's eyes, I noticed that her face beamed with a drunken pride. It flushed with victory, as though she personally stormed the plantations of the slavers. In this moment of moral ascendancy, her posture communicated the regality of a marble Caesarean bust. She posed with the gravitas of an Augustan emperor, expecting the adoration that station demanded. My riposte was swift. I said, in the 20th century, perhaps more people were murdered by political ideologies than had been killed by all ancient civil strifes combined. If we're more murderous than we've ever been, can we honestly claim to be superior? The brevity of my refutation was so jarring that she erupted in racial and sexual epithets. And why should I listen to you, a straight white man? In that moment, the dynamic of the exchange became clear. I was not engaged in a good faith dialogue about the merits of the Western canon. I was a heckler at an onanistic ceremony. My interlocutor was on stage anticipating a golden statuette for her aggrandizement, and I had deflated the investiture by describing it as masturbatory. I cannot help but feel there was a deliberate scatological dimension to the affair. The behavior of my opponent was certainly obscene, but she had a brazen expectation that her obscenity should elicit applause. It was as though she imagined critics showering her with praise. The audaciousness of her performance transcended camp and became high art. But she was really a pornographer who insisted she was making love. Her gravity disguised her insincerity. The debate was a pretense for moral preening. I shared this anecdote with you because I've had an insight about media criticism and conversation, one that's not held uniformly, but is ubiquitous enough to be noticeable and to have become incredibly grating. And I've decided to articulate this insight in the form of a manifesto. And that manifesto can be summarized with a rather straightforward aphorism. And that's this: media critics are annoying. They are monumentally annoying. And it's because they have assumed a posture of unearned moral superiority. This individual with whom I was debating spoke about the liberation of slaves as though she had personally masterminded the abolitionist movement. It was absolutely extraordinary. And when you engage with a lot of media criticism, you find that critics take on this same posture of assumed righteousness. It's really extraordinary, and you can almost imagine them for a moment, standing on top of the cathedral that is the Western canon, looking down at the artisans, the craftsmen, and the engineers who built this marvelous structure with a kind of sneering disdain and a sense of entitlement that they really are the executors of this estate. Not only do they deserve this inheritance, but that they are more worthy of it than the people who built it. And as they look from the top of the cathedral at all of the additions they plan to make to this structure, they're not imagining honoring the saints who created it, but creating stained glass windows commemorating their own virtue. I want to make it clear, this is not a criticism of the left or the right. I think that the problem of unearned moral superiority is uniform across the political spectrum. You find it in content creators like Lindsay Ellis and Movie Bob. You also find it in content creators like The Critical Drinker. This posture of condescension, of moral superiority, of smug knowing, and an insistence of moral rectitude. And it is simply unbearable to endure. The left looks at the past and complains about the lack of progressive values in media, and the right looks at the present and complains at the ubiquity of progressive values in media. It is endless. So what's going on here? Media critics have forgotten the institution that made their moral insights possible. When you engage with the Western canon, you see profound ideas from the very beginning in the Bible, in Greek philosophy, in Greek poetry, in Greek drama, right? All culminating in an ideology of ethical understanding, developing over centuries as we realize this insight that all human beings share a kind of commonality, and that there is a brotherhood of man. What's happened is that these critics have appropriated the moral triumphs of their ancestors and have forgotten from whom they inherited these moral triumphs. So all of this raises a serious question. Why does discourse about media have this unrelenting moral atmosphere? The answer is found in aesthetic philosophy, right? Entertainment media is not a chaotic jumble of images and sounds. It is all intentional. It embodies gesture. These gestures reflect our agency and are thus always colored by a moral character, either dignified or debased, graceful or grotesque. As music moves from dissonance to consonance, or as characters move from conflict to resolution, the arc of a piece of media mirrors human life and moral struggle. We intuitively feel the weight of conflict and the peace of resolution. And this is precisely why we engage with media, for the sake of this pathos, to experience the resolution from a state of dissonance. We watch as characters make decisions over the course of a story, and we judge them. And in doing so, we judge ourselves as we internalize the choices that they've made. And we come to understand what is right and what is wrong. And those stories become a part of our own story. As a consequence, media has an inherent moral dimension. But what makes a piece of media morally resonant and affecting? I want to engage in a little bit of a thought experiment here. I want you to consider for a moment that great art requires a sense of restraint in order for the moral rectitude of a piece to resonate with the human spirit. Imagine for a moment that you're watching a serious and perhaps sobering piece of fiction. You're reading a tragedy, and then suddenly, at the climax of the tragedy, a musical number breaks out. We would judge this sudden turn of tone and intent to be a little grotesque and disgusting, especially if the pathos of the tragedy was especially affecting, right? Or imagine for a moment that you're watching a children's film, one intended for adults and children alike. And in the middle of this entertaining piece of fiction for all audiences, pornography is inserted into the climax of the movie. And this would be rightly seen as morally depraved. Okay? One of the things that is pervasive in media today and pervasive in criticism is a lack of restraint. We find in media that characters are often acting, well, not stoically to say the least, that they are emotionally unrestrained. We find that critics are in a constant state of moral preening, condemning media that existed prior to our present age, right? There is a lack of integrity, both in the media that is produced in terms of its thematic integrity, and a lack of integrity in the examination of themes in film criticism. There is instead this grotesque insertion of self and personal preferences and political ideologies into media at large, an attempt in criticism to extract political insights from pieces that are not inherently political. For a work of art to be great, for media to be truly entertaining and affecting, it should not professedly preach, and it shouldn't professedly teach to communicate wisdom, but it must do both unself-consciously in order to endure. And it's this self-conscious insertion of our own egos into media and into media criticism that has caused a disruption of the virtue of entertainment. When entertainment loses this restraint, it also loses its moral bearing. It becomes chaotic or corporate or a sensual stimulant, and it ceases to speak to us. The West has undergone a kind of cultural amnesia. There was a time when art was properly understood as a repository of moral truth, and that's because it actually is. And we still have the intuition that art should inform our character and shape us. But we've lost this genealogy of ideas that built the metaphysics of media consumption. And we no longer have the vocabulary necessary to describe media as a repository of moral truth. And instead, we are in this sort of crazed effort to dig a well and create a repository of truth cultivated entirely from our own intuitions. Art in the past was understood as central to moral formation, and educated people knew that art had the power to shape our understanding of what is right and what is wrong. But because modern critics have rejected the moral insights of our forefathers, they're no longer able to experience the moral formation inherent in the Western canon. Now, one of the most extraordinary realities of human nature is that just because you reject a moral framework does not mean you cease to have any kind of moral intuitions. Indeed, our moral intuitions do continue, but without proper formation, we cannot discern between what is right and what is wrong. And people mistake what is good for what is evil and what is evil for what is good. And what's more than that, they call what is good evil, and they call what is evil good. And they do so with the moral certainty of a saint. We live in a world where our intuitions about the moral dimension of entertainment remain, but the metaphysical framework to consciously understand the moral urgency of fiction has dissipated. Because critics have lost these metaphysical insights, they no longer have the conceptual framework to critique media objectively. And having lost objectivity, they have also lost restraint. Modern media criticism is a revelation of this disorder. Because media critics and media creators believe they are morally superior, they have concluded that there are no more moral lessons for them to learn. And I want you to contemplate for a moment the great tragedy of believing that you are better than everybody who has preceded you. You have nothing left to learn. There is no more growth for you to undergo, and there is nothing more for you to become. All that's left is a spectacle of self-congratulation. And there is no reason to celebrate the human spirit because you have triumphed over it. All right, guys, let me know what you think. Leave a comment, like, subscribe, share this video. Tell me what you think is wrong with the media criticism and what we can do in order to shape a culture that will lead people to the good. Have a wonderful day.